This is the April 13th Public Brookline Policy Review Subcommittee meeting. Okay, let's get right in. We've got a set of minutes from the last meeting, March 30th, 2020, that we need to vote on. I will move those. Would somebody like to second those? David, I think you're muted, but I recognize your seconding. And I think we need to do this by roll call vote. So Mr. Perlman?
Yes.
Ms. Monopoly?
Yes.
And the chair votes yes. All right, so those are moved unanimous, or those are voted and approved unanimously. And we can move right on to our next item on the agenda, which is the review of draft policy on homeless students, enrollment rights and services. And there was I think a little bit of a confusion on my part last time in not remembering that I'd asked David to draft that, and I went ahead and drafted a version of my own. But the version that came around with the invite tonight was David's version. So that's the version that we're gonna work off of. David, thank you for doing that, and I apologize for my confusion on that. And so hopefully everybody's had a chance to look at it. We can just sort of flip through, and if folks have things that they want to talk about, certainly chime in. Jennifer, is there any place where you wanted to start on this?
No, not in particular. I did want to let you know that I did in our chat box that we have an attendee, and I was just curious and I sort of wondered out loud. And so if you look in your text box, it'll tell you. So we have a Boy Scout online with us from the local troop in Brookline who's attending to complete a requirement for his merit badge. So we have an attendee, which is pretty cool. So anyways, the homeless policy, the homeless students policy, David has a lot of insight into this. And so I don't have in my notes any particular areas that I wanted to discuss. I was really interested to see what the two of you, had for input, and Casey, as far as, our legal requirements. And if I'm not mistaken, this is a new policy for us and not a revision. That's why David was drafting it. So, it seemed reasonable to me. I think, I was trying to, this policy, and then was there a foster policy? Is that our other policy as well?
Yes.
They look a little bit different, and I wondered how much different they really needed to be. I don't know. So that's where I was starting off from. I see Sharon is raising her hand. No, you're just waiting. Okay.
I'm just managing my volume. I apologize for being late. I got off of a call late.
No problem.
Okay, so that's where I was just wondering about the two policies, and then I just wanted to sort of see where we're at from a legal perspective, if there was anything in here that we hadn't covered or that might open us up to issues that we need to sort of fine tune the language on.
So just to address that question about why they look a little different, first I use the MASC draft policies as sort of my baseline. And then I also looked up to make sure that whatever the MASC was saying, whatever I'm going to say, will be in harmony with the relevant federal statute as well as state. So some of this language I could not change even if I wanted to. So for example, on the first page of the homeless student policy definitions, so 1 through 8, the federal government lays that out. It even uses those exact words. So I can't really change that, even though I personally, if I were drafting it, I'd want to have a little more clarity around the definition of homelessness. I'm a little concerned that at times it can be too broad, but again, that's not our choice. That's what the federal government has declared it. And then similarly, on the foster care one, there was that issue where I couldn't modify that language. So whenever you have the federal government saying these are the requirements, you can always add more, but you can't undercut the federal government. So we can provide additional benefits to our students as long as we are including the baseline. So most of my additions are either trying to clarify certain areas, explaining what they mean, or I'm trying to confer some extra benefits for our students. And most of that was around continuity of education. So technically, there are instances where a child could just be dropped from the Brookline schools, but if they are in the final year of schooling, I'd rather let them be able to finish. And I think as a district, we would want to encourage that rather than if we have an 8th grader or a 12th grader say that we're going to drop them right away. Also, there are times where districts are trying to figure out where a child is going to be attending school. And I had concern that, let's say that determination is made 2 weeks into a term. That could be extremely disruptive. So I'd want to allow that student to remain at least until that report card or reporting period. So that's something that we would be taking up on our own. That's not federally required or required by state law.
Thank you, David. I guess I'll start. I have more questions than anything. I think generally the policy is in a good place. The draft policy is in a good place. Let's see, and sorry, I'm not as well versed on this as you are, David. So in the early on, we sort of talk about the two different types of homeless students that we're covering by this policy. The first of which is enrolled PSB students who become homeless and are temporarily housed outside of Brookline. And I think somewhere further down, we talk about what counts as temporary, right?
Yes.
And what do we say? We say, just trying to remember. Sorry, I'm looking for it. I can't find it. If you beat me to it, go ahead. And
under definitions, number 7, temporary housing provided by Department of Transitional Assistance or other government agencies. Is that where you're looking?
Well, I guess I'm looking in what I think is under the preamble in B. We talk about we're intending this to apply to those two sort of subcategories, if I'm looking at the right version.
Right, I see that part.
And we just talk about, I guess my question is about, have we been clear in sort of conveying our intent of what it means to be temporarily housed outside of Brookline elsewhere in the text? I'm not saying that we haven't. There was a question that sort of came, and I just wanted to talk about it a little bit. Reason being, if there's no, 6 months is one thing, a year is another thing, 5 years is another thing. Is it just, do we sort of define this? What constitutes temporary somewhere?
I think you're right. That needs to be defined more narrowly.
And I don't have a sense of what is appropriate. If others have thoughts about that, feel free to chime in.
David, Maria Litas, who's the Director of Guidance and Clinical Services, who's also our, as you probably know, our homelessness liaison for the district, has done a lot with this and the state, both on the foster care side and for families who are homeless. So if you want sort of her thoughts on where to land with definition for temporary, I'm sure she'd be happy to talk with you.
All right.
I have a question if you're still taking questions.
Yes.
Different from Michael. So
before you do that, Casey, can I just mention one thing just to follow on this point just before we change topics?
Yep.
I'm now looking at what is it? I think section 4B. No. I thought there was somewhere in here. No, never mind. I'm sorry. That has to do with something else. Go ahead, Casey.
Okay. Under section 4, letter D, for homeless students who are entitled to transportation, I don't remember, but I know that there is I think maybe a recommended, I don't think it's a mandated, um, total number of time, like length of the bus ride for student, where it's considered acceptable by the state. I'm wondering if you considered, either just changing whatever is recommended or even noting what's recommended by the state.
I think we could at least note the recommendation.
Okay.
Fine. I'll look for that.
So, go ahead, Casey. I'm sorry.
We've had families who were originally in Brookline and then placed in Lynn. And what we did was taking into consideration the age of the students and the length of time it would take for the students to be bused to Brookline. We worked it out where the family would register instead in Lynn and attend school there solely based on the length of time that the kids would be on the bus there and back. I just want to make sure the policy has something in there that would be helpful for us to just follow rather than, make our own determinations, I guess.
We do want to be very careful, though, about making determinations that are based on the commute alone, because it is pretty clear that the decision is supposed to be about the interests of the student. Now, obviously, if the student's riding a bus for too long, that's not in his or her best interest. So it's related in that sense.
Yeah.
But we never want to be making decisions based solely on commute time. And the law is pretty clear about that it needs to be about the best interests of the student and not so much about the logistics, because that's how continuity in education becomes an issue. Generally, it's around transportation where districts, I'm talking about districts in general, not necessarily Brookline, where districts might just sort of throw their hands up in the air and say, forget it, let's enroll the student wherever they're currently living. And that's where you end up with these very real problems. I deal with it all the time, where a child's in 5 different schools in 1 year, and it's because everyone's complaining about the commute. So for that reason, I am quite confident that maybe there's a guideline around what's considered too long, but the standard really is best interest of the child for his or her academic well-being.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Can I just mention one thing on this? Because I think we're actually, in my mind, these are 2 separate issues. There's a question of what's in the best interest of the student from an educational perspective. And then there's a question of whose obligation is it to pay for transportation. And I think those are actually 2 different things that we might be conflating a little bit here. And I'm not sure that we should, for the purposes of this provision, or maybe we should, I don't know. I mean, a determination is made one way or the other that the student should stay in Brookline, and it's in their best interest. Is there any scenario in which district is not bound to, or not required, or shouldn't be required to pay for the transportation? And my initial mind goes to an extreme example, right? One that might not really come up. Someone's in Worcester, and the determination is made that the best interest is for that child to continue to go to school in Brookline. Is that sufficient? Well, what if it's Springfield? What if it's Pittsfield? So this idea of best interest versus paying for transportation, I think, are 2 different issues, and I think we should think about them that way, and ask the question whether there are any sort of outside parameters on when we should or shouldn't pay for education or for transportation.
So generally what happens, the 2 districts negotiate with each other. So the receiving district as well as the district where the student lives. And sometimes the state agency will cover the costs as well. So that happens in every instance where you have all 3 of those actors negotiating who's going to pay for what and how that will look like. In practice, though, when the situation you've just raised comes up, then the child's going to be enrolled locally where he or she lives. So there's already a structure for that, where you have all 3 districts. You have the 2 districts in communication with one another, plus the state.
So if I'm just reading the section again. I guess a question I have, and I'm still looking at the language again, is are we then committing ourselves to being 100% responsible for the costs of transportation when there may be, even in situations where it could be split? I guess, are we undercutting our negotiating power in our own policy vis-a-vis the costs of the transportation, or am I not thinking about it the right way?
I'm not 100% sure that's even up to us. So this paragraph I basically lifted from the MASC policy.
Okay.
And if you read the statutory citation, it does seem to really fall on the district. But then it explains that you negotiate with the other district and you try to get funding from the state, and then you make a broader decision about whether it would be in the best interests of the students to have that much travel time. So usually it works itself out, but I'm a bit nervous about altering the language that is apparently based on federal law. Because if you look at the original, I didn't really change it at all, other than just putting PSB for the district.
Right.
David, am I correct in understanding that the district from which the student was originally at, they're the ones that pay for the transportation? So if a child is homeless, right, becomes homeless, lives in Brookline, becomes homeless and is living temporarily in another town, we would pay for that transportation.
That is the default, but we do talk to the receiving district, and because sometimes there might be several students that are going in roughly in that direction, and you can have an agreement with some other community. There are lots of ways that this ends up working out. Sometimes the foster parent's willing to do it. Sometimes some other person, if DCF is involved, is willing to provide transportation. So there are a lot of ways that it happens. It's really a case-to-case basis.
My only other concern as I'm listening to us talk is who decides, and I guess maybe this is when it goes to arbitration, but who gets to decide what in the best interest of the student means? I mean, I think that different participants in the process may feel differently.
So I think that's spelled out a bit more in the foster care one, but it's supposed to be the district that the student had been attending. They get together. DCF is also involved in that. Pretty much anyone else who has been working with the child and can provide specialized expertise on that child's needs. They get together, they have a meeting, and they determine the best interest.
But in this policy,
if there's a dispute, DCF would decide. Now, in this one with homeless children, that's not necessary. DCF might not be involved because homelessness isn't necessarily.
No. I mean, I don't think that, I mean, I think it's just as likely that they're not involved. And so in that case, how does it just go to arbitration? If the district, parents think, or family or guardian feels one way and the district feels another, what happens? Like who decides what it's just such vague language, and it's very well intentioned. And I know it's not your language, it just is, and I'm just concerned about like who decides what that.
Turn on again. No, you hold down.
I mean, maybe there's not an answer to that. Maybe it's just that we go to arbitration.
I agree. I'll try to look into that. Who makes the best interest determination for homeless students? That's a good point.
I mean, it would be great if it was both parties coming together, all parties coming together to decide together. Maybe that's the intention. And if an agreement can't be made, then it goes to arbitration.
And David, I might, just going back on the transportation piece, I mean, if you're 100% confident that this is what the law requires, that's fine. I guess I do worry a little bit about our negotiating position in a policy with our negotiating position with another district, if it's not absolutely required by federal law.
I suppose we could soften it. So in the second sentence, the PSB will endeavor to transport or something like that. So it's not an absolute guarantee.
Yeah, I mean, something like that might work. I just worry about the extreme situation where it doesn't logically make sense for us to be transporting. But maybe there isn't one. I'm open to sort of saying it's something that we shouldn't worry about. I just worry about this.
I have a possible scenario. So if we have a student who's living in Brookline, becomes homeless, and is reassigned to the Worcester district, and Worcester Public Schools decides that it cannot serve the student and recommends an out-of-district school, in the Worcester area. With this language, Brookline would still have to pay for the student to go from Worcester, where he or she is residing, to that school, right? To that out-of-district school.
I think there's an argument that yes, the way this is worded, we would have to, and that's not to say we would shirk any responsibility that we have under the law.
Sure.
I just don't. I want to just be careful about being able to be. In that scenario, I would want to be able. If we had the ability, I'd want to be able to go back to Worcester and say, Worcester, you need to split these costs with us, or we need to negotiate something to make this work.
Right.
All right, so how about something like this? The PSB will endeavor to help coordinate transportation for students who are sheltered or temporarily residing within Brookline to the student school of origin.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm okay with that as long as it, we're not going in the other direction and violating federal law or
Yeah, that's my concern. I mean, that starts to sound like it lacks a commitment to upholding the law. If the law stipulates that we have to pay, that we have to provide transportation.
Yeah, maybe we just need to be some clarity on what the law requires. All right, we'll put a pin in that for now, and maybe we can try and get better educated on that piece. All right. Other issues folks want to raise or questions? All right.
I'll just say that I would prefer that we didn't put any particular time deadlines around temporary placement out of district. I understand your concerns, but I also think that the contingencies in the cases that David is describing could put an unsuspecting kid just on the other side of a 6-month limit or a 12-month limit in a way that could be really, disruptive and traumatic, and that they would have no control over whatsoever, and could, end up sort of force us into a position where we're sort of terminating their enrollment. It's ending up getting, questioned, and then we have to reestablish their enrollment, and it could end up causing a discontinuity in education that's created by us that then we end up having to walk back because of an arbitrary deadline.
That's a fair thing to consider. I think I was thinking more on a more extreme than 6 or 12 months. If we're talking about extended homelessness for being housed in another district for several years. I think there's a question of whether it's still, at what point does, and I'm not saying that maybe the answer is if it's 12, 13 years of that student's educational career that we have to educate that student for that entire time. I just don't know in all scenarios that that's going to be the appropriate answer. Maybe it is. I don't know. But I wasn't necessarily thinking of a 6-month or 12-month limitation. I was thinking about something more.
That's fair, but I also think that we have to kind of consider, let's say, for example, that I don't think that this is going to happen, but that there is a 12 or 13-year scenario. Let's say a divided household for some reason, right? In which we were to want to be able to have the option to educate the student due to the student's best interest for various contingencies that none of us can currently predict. Would putting that kind of time limit in place prevent us from implementing the education service delivery that we want to deliver? Would we could end up in a situation, for example, where we're constantly forcing the household or the family to like keep unenrolling and then re-enrolling the student so that they don't, it's like a consulting, right? Where you only get to have a contract for 11 and a half months, then you have to take off for a couple months, and then you have to come back so that you can re-enroll again, et cetera. Like if we put into place those kinds of timelines, we could end up creating a situation in which the timeline itself creates the discontinuity.
Okay. I think that's something we can continue to think about. It's, we may be able to also think about, I don't know if there's any optionality in terms of the district's ability to make alternate decisions, right? If there's extenuating circumstances that justify some kind of waiver or whatever, that's something that we can think about.
Yeah, I was going to suggest if there's a possibility that if there's a limit, then we say at which time we will reevaluate the situation. So therefore, they don't have to unenroll and re-enroll.
But isn't that a procedure rather than a policy?
No, I don't think so. I think a fixed timeline is not necessarily, I think it could live in a procedure, but it could also live in policy, in the policy itself, in terms of what we want to do. I mean, I think there is a question of, that I think we're sort of circling around as to maybe there shouldn't be a time limit. And maybe that's what people are trying to say and don't want to say it, but we can talk about that. I mean, maybe it should be anyone who becomes homeless is a Brookline resident who then becomes homeless out of district, regardless of where they end up. If they remain homeless, for as long as they remain homeless, they should be able to be educated in Brookline. I mean, is that what we want to say, or are there scenarios where that's too broad?
So I think so that's not what I want to say. I don't actually want to set it. That's not actually where I'm going with this. What I'm actually more concerned about is the fact that it seems to me like there's a number of institutional mechanisms for, arriving at a judgment about what's in the child's best interest. And some of those are going to be court-based, and some of them are going to be caseworker-based, and some of them are going to be the process of conversations between schools. But what I don't want to do, is set up a district policy in which, we are getting into a fight with a judge over where the judge thinks that the kid should be, because we have a specific time stipulation, because I think that when you're, and David could definitely speak to this more than I can, but when you're talking about even in the current environment, right, where you just have a whole bunch of unanticipated court delays, right? I know I've had at least 3 court cases that have been canceled on me in the last 2 weeks for some of the work that I do, right? That could just end up putting a kid outside of a deadline that, some staffer could just, turn into an unenrollment. And then we end up going back into a situation in which the ruling that was going to be made about where it is that the kid needs to be and where it is that they need to go to school by whatever agency or court that needs to make that ruling, or body needs that, or household that needs to make that decision, is just, unlucky because of a timeline that we put into place. I think that, that we should be presuming some threshold of reasonableness, if that makes any sense. What if you are a kid who's whose parents are in the middle of some big custody mess, and your housing's all over the place, and you're staying with your grandparents, and then the court case just kind of keeps getting moved, right? Does that mean that one day in the middle of February you could just get kicked out of school because you hit a 12-month line or you hit a 24-month line? Some of these things take a really, really, really long time to work their way through, and that kid has no control over that situation, nor arguably necessarily do the adults.
Yeah,
Sure,
no,
I see that for the foster care scenario. I'm less concerned about that for the homeless student one, just because homelessness is a very specific definition, which is section 2, 1 through 8, and that's basically how the federal government lays it out. My only modification was I specified one of the government agencies that provide temporary housing, which would be within Massachusetts, obviously, would be the Massachusetts Department of Transitional Assistance, but otherwise, this is completely lifted from the federal regulation. So your scenario about living with the grandparents, that would not count as homelessness, or living with one parent, not the other, that wouldn't be homelessness. So if it's not one of these 8 categories, then that scenario probably wouldn't come to pass.
so let me give a different scenario, David, and maybe, and I'm not sure where I am on this, and in terms of thinking about how it should work. Let's just say there's a student who is for their entire educational career, they've started in Brookline for whatever reason, and in kindergarten or first grade, they end up needing to go into to live in a motel that is paid for by the state. I don't think the state does this anymore, but or maybe they do. But this is something I know the state has done in the past, where they sort of put homeless residents into hotels and motels, and that's out of district. A couple towns over, who knows where it is, and that continues for that student's entire educational career. In that scenario, what do we say? Is there a point where we say, well, you really should be going to school in the district where this hotel motel lies, or should we say, well, you started in Brookline, so you get to, as long as you remain quote unquote homeless, you get to continue to come to Brookline schools? And I don't know the answer to that question in my own mind.
I personally would actually be for saying that the student can continue, because what happens with these motel arrangements, and yes, the state still does that, is it'll change very frequently. So sometimes the homeless person or the foster student is at one motel for a month, and then the next month it's somewhere else. And usually they'll keep them in the same metropolitan area, but they're bouncing around all over the place. And so if we establish that as a rule, then we would have children at 5 schools a year. And I think we would want to avoid that. Also, just in terms of looking at, and I know this can be a bit callous, but looking at this from the cost perspective, my understanding is we don't have that many homeless students in Brookline. I think the number is 5. Casey, do you know what it is? So it's a pretty small number. And the scenario you're laying out, even among that already small number, would probably be very low, because usually, especially with a child is not going to remain homeless for that long a period of time. Generally, within, I'd say 3-4 years at most, there will be some kind of permanency for that child, whether it's adoption or some other relative is stepping in. So I think this scenario would be so rare that even if it were to happen, I wouldn't be particularly worried about it.
David, did you say 5? David, did you say 5 homeless students?
I think I heard Nicole say that at a previous meeting, but I could be wrong. I don't know.
So it's definitely more than 5. I can get that number for you maybe during even this call. But with that new shelter that opened last year, we saw an increase. CCS, because it's in that district, absorbed, I want to say 6 to 8. Sharon, you're nodding because maybe you know the number. And as of a few months ago, the shelter was only half full, and they expected it to be full within the next 6 months.
Yeah, there's at least one family. There's at least one family in that shelter when it was half full that had 5 or 4.
Correct. That's right. Yeah. And they span like K through high school ages wise.
Yeah, exactly. So there's definitely more than 5 in the district.
Keep in mind,
I think the shelter has capacity of 16 families.
But keep in mind that although those students are at a Brookline shelter, unless the child is turning 2.9 while at that shelter, the default position for families in that shelter would be to send their kids to other districts. So those children are not necessarily in the Brookline schools. So do we have a number of homeless children who are from Brookline and then end up and placed somewhere else, because children who are within Brookline or coming from elsewhere wouldn't be in the Brookline schools necessarily.
So those children,
They could opt to enroll here, no? If they are living in Brookline in a shelter in Brookline, they can elect to come here. So we could have students that are living outside Brookline coming here, and students living inside Brookline who are homeless also coming here. So we've got sort of, because this policy has sort of two subsets of children in it, we also could have two subsets of numbers we're looking at here. Kids from outside Brookline, homeless kids from inside Brookline. I'd be interested just to know, now talking about it, what those numbers are.
and like also like, doesn't that also work in the opposite direction? If, for example, you're talking about like shelter families, like for domestic violence, because like you wouldn't want kids to be going back potentially to their like primary school like location for safety reasons if they're, you know, if there's concern about their like child safety and protection, right? Like we would want them to be able to enroll here using the shelter access, like the shelter's residents to have access to our schools in order to prevent, for example, them being like abducted or, you know, subject to something else by their like by an abuser.
Well, that's where the best interest determination comes into play, because you also have the reverse, where a family is homeless or a child's in foster care, a child is being moved from house to house, and the only continuity he or she has in his or her life is the school community, having the same teacher, having the same friends. And that's why the presumption is on the side of keeping the child in the original school. Because if there is not that safety issue about potential abduction, and fortunately, usually there isn't, but as long as that's not the main issue, and generally it's better for the child to have some degree of continuity, at least because you're already losing your family. So to also lose your friends and your teachers and everyone else is very difficult.
I just heard from Maria Litas. We have 27 students who are attending schools in Brookline who have the status of being homeless.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think we're probably to some degree going to need to come back to this policy. So let's just put a pin in that issue for the moment. Although I will say, I'm sort of, you know, through this conversation, I am starting to wonder whether it really matters, whether or not we ascribe any sort of time periods to it, to any piece of this. Just, but we can save that for now. Are there other issues on this policy that we want to sort of identify as things we want to talk about? Okay. Hearing nothing. I'm just flipping through it again myself here as we're talking.
I'm comfortable with the policy as written.
Okay.
I don't see any revisions, and I wouldn't want to water down the other language that was suggested. You know, because as I mentioned before, concerns about sort of you know, trying to, I don't know, mitigate our responsibility for providing transportation where we're, you know, federally required to.
Well, I guess I'm not sure. I'm not convinced we are federally required to in all circumstances, but maybe we can sort of dig into that and come back next time and talk about that. So certainly we're going to adhere to any legal requirements that we have. So okay, all right. Why don't we? There's a couple things we'll talk about next time, or the next time we get around to this particular policy. Why don't we spend a little bit of time talking about the other policy, the foster children policy? David, do you want to give us any sort of intro on this, or
It's actually fairly similar to the discussion we're just having about homeless students, the same types of issues about transportation, placement, best interest determinations, although for foster students, the best interest determination is more specifically laid out.
Okay.
In both of these cases, David, oh, sorry, Michael.
No, go ahead, Jennifer.
In both of these cases, for both of these policies, this is not something that either families or the district, or maybe I'm more concerned about families having to take us up on an offer to keep a student here. If they want to go to where they are living because it's more convenient, that's an option, right? That's their choice.
For if it's a homeless student who's with the legal guardians or parents, yes. If it's a foster care situation, then no, because the foster parent is not going to have legal custody. It's going to be DCF that generally has legal custody, so that would be more DCF's determination.
No, that's okay. I'm thinking in a situation where children are with one or both parents or a guardian. I just wanted to make sure that the language in our policy didn't put any requirements on families to adhere to our rules if they would rather that their child attend, say they're in a shelter or other temporary housing, and they would prefer
Yes.
that the child be close to them, for purposes of.
That would be fine.
Okay, I'm just clarifying. Thank you.
All right. Other questions or comments regarding this draft policy? Did you have anything you wanted to raise?
Not on this one, no. Thank you. Thanks, David, on both of these.
Welcome. Mainly, part of what I added was, and this is a pet peeve of mine as an attorney in this area, providing access of the best interest determination and relevant records to the court-appointed attorney, because sometimes DCF will just sort of unilaterally make these decisions and impose them on the school districts, won't apprise the attorney, won't really tell anybody. And that's not following the law either. The school district is supposed to be actively involved. There needs to be a formal best interest determination. So I added more detail from the statute in terms of what that process needs to look like.
Okay. Okay. All right. Not hearing a lot further comments on this. I'll just go back to a second for the homeless children's policy, homeless students policy, since we appear to not have any comments on the foster care one. There was one change that I just wanted to sort of talk about that I forgot previously, so forgive me. Hold on one sec, I'm just finding it. It had to do with educational records and directory information. So we're back in section 6 of the homeless students policy. Says information regarding a homeless student's living arrangements. Let's see. Shall not be considered directory information. So
the reason for that is to protect the students, because some of these shelters are domestic violence based, and so if you're publishing in the school directory where the student's living, then someone else might be able to get access to that, and that could create a safety risk.
Right. So you struck. So I noticed this only because I had looked a little bit at this. I noticed that you took out that the language that from the MASC model that said shall be considered a student education record. I
just wondering about that a little bit. The reason I ask is because I think there are FERPA implications on that.
That there are what implications? Sorry.
FERPA implications. There are FERPA implications on that in terms of that information, whether it matters. We designate it as an education record. I think we can still say it's not directory information.
All right. I don't have any problem putting it back in. It's fine.
Okay. All right. So why don't we do this with both of these? Why don't we think about everything that's been said here? There's a little bit of sort of background work that David, I hope you'll take the lead on in terms of maybe getting some additional information on some of the questions that that have been raised on a few of these points. And we'll come back and we'll touch upon both of these policies the next time we have an opportunity to talk about them. And then hopefully after that, at that meeting, we'll be in a position to perhaps advance both of these to a first reading. If that makes sense to folks.
Okay.
Okay. So this is all we had on the agenda for this evening. We do have more time allocated. I wanted to make sure we got to these two, and I didn't want to necessarily go back and sort of muddy the waters by bringing more on the field trip policy, as well as school council stuff that we talked about last time. So we can talk about that at our next meeting. Is there anything else that people want to touch on tonight before we adjourn? Okay.
Maybe, sorry, could we just take a minute and just sort of sketch out what we might have on the next agenda, when we might be able to get these to a first reading, and where we are on like what the timeline is for field trip, like sort of like what we've got in the queue, when can we finalize those, and what's coming up next? Which I think we can probably do in a few minutes.
I'm sorry, Robin, was that you?
No, it wasn't.
Oh, okay. Sorry. So I don't believe, Robin, correct me if I'm wrong, we have the May meeting still on the schedule.
I think you have a meeting scheduled. You had talked about meeting on this week, actually, on the 21st.
Oh, on the 21st, that's right. Did we say 5 o'clock for that meeting?
That's right.
I have 5:30. Is it going to be 5 that day?
I can do 5. Is 5 a problem? Do we need to make it 5:30?
I'm okay.
Okay. Everybody else okay with 5?
Yes.
Okay.
Works for me.
Okay. So let's do 5 next week. In terms of, so we've got kind of 4 topics kind of working right now, I think, although correct me if I'm wrong. We've got field trip policy, which there's a few things that we need to pick up from last meeting to try to get in here. If I remember correctly, mostly a lot of it is relating to the comment that we received at the first reading, which was relating to the financial piece and how this dovetails with the financial assistance policy. Then we've got school council stuff. I don't know if we remember. I think I might have circulated some possible changes to the actual policy.
I don't think I've seen those.
Maybe I didn't. Maybe I'm making that up. So I'll revisit whether there are some suggested changes to the actual policy. And we had, the procedures that have been circulated are there if folks want to comment on them and talk about them more at this particular subcommittee, that could be something that's done. Going back to the field trip, I don't know if next meeting, we should probably put it on the agenda just to bring it back up. I don't know if we'll be in a position at the end of that meeting or not to bring it to a second reading and possible vote. We can see. I do think it's realistic that we can probably get the homeless students policy as well as foster students policy to a first reading or in a place where they can be brought for a first reading. So we can try to sort of touch on all four of those at the next meeting if folks think that that's appropriate and doable. We'll just have to be efficient with our time, which if we're anything like today, maybe we can do. So why don't we plan on that tentatively? And we will, I don't know, we might want to think about a next meeting after the 21st. We could look at the week of the 27th if folks want to just try to keep things moving. Is that something folks might be interested in?
Fine with that, yes.
Okay. Looking at Monday the 27th, I guess I'll throw out 5 o'clock. Does that work for folks?
Works. Is this in addition to the 20th, Michael?
This would be in addition to the 21st.
Oh, right. Okay. It works for me.
It's fine.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think about if we might be able to get something on a school committee agenda for a reading, what the timing might be that we need to get it on the agenda. Like let full school committee know that it's coming so that Robin can put it on the agenda.
Well, I think
we have a school committee meeting on the 30th. So if we felt we were ready to go on the 27th, there would technically be enough time to get it on the docket for the 30th. A little tight, but that's more than 48 hours.
and we might know by the end of the meeting on the 21st whether there's certain things that can go.
Yes.
So it's not. So I think making that. I think knowing that that's something that we need to think about further at the meeting on the 21st is helpful. Okay.
So are we on for that Monday, the 27th? That's for sure.
Yeah, let's put it on there, 5 o'clock. And yeah, that's great. So if there's nothing further, we can adjourn and everybody can go on with their evening.
Dinner. Woohoo!
All right.
All right.